The top domestic violent extremist threat comes from those who advocated for the superiority of the white race.
I mean, no, just statistically, no. It's coming from people who believe that there's an excuse for violence across the nation rooted in America's history of racism. There's one ideology that the left wishes to ignore when it is tied to violence. We all know what that ideology is. Okay. Merrick Garland, who's the new Attorney General, yesterday was testifying, and he said that the top domestic violent extremist threat comes from white supremacists, which is kind of an amazing statement given the fact that we've seen an uptick in murder across the nation, numbering thousands of murders across the nation over the course of the last year, connected to a deeper root belief in the systemic nature of American racism. We have seen $2 billion of damage done last year alone in the vast spate of rioting connected to ideology. These were outgrowths of actual protests. And yet apparently the only threat that is worth talking about is the white supremacist terror threat. Again, you don't have to downplay one to talk up the other. You can talk up both. But I've noticed that we're not talking about both. We're only talking about one. It happens to be the one that is responsible, yes, for a certain number of murders in the last year. And we are downplaying the other one that is responsible for the collapse of major American cities. Here is Merrick Garland.
According to an unclassified summary of the March intelligence assessment, the two most lethal elements of the domestic violence extremist threat are racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists and militia violent extremists. In the FBI's view, the top domestic violent extremist threat comes from racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically those who advocated for the superiority of the white race.
Okay, so that is the greatest domestic violence threat in America. Not just terrorist threat, domestic violent threats in America. Okay, no. I mean, no. Just statistically, no. The greatest domestic violence threat that is tied to ideology in America is not coming from white supremacists. It's coming from people who believe that there's an excuse for violence across the nation rooted in America's history of racism. It is the group of people in government, in the halls of power, and yes, on the ground, committing acts of violence right now, committing crimes, who blame that on American racism and suggest that the violence is justified because, you know what, America sort of deserves it. And again, it's amazing how people on the left will actively downplay this threat because it is so closely tied to some of the things that they promote. So Merrick Garland says, don't worry, guys, we're not focused on ideology. This is not an attempt to crack down on ideology. We're just focused on violence purely and specifically.
We are focused on violence, not on ideology. In America, espousing a hateful ideology is not unlawful. We do not investigate individuals for their First Amendment protected activities. We do not prosecute people for their beliefs. Across the world, extremist or terrorist labels have at times been affixed to those perceived as political threats to the ruling order. But there is no place for partisanship in the enforcement of the law.
Okay, so he's saying, at least we're going to preserve free speech in all of this, right? That's really what we're going to do. Now, I have a question. Do you trust them to preserve free speech? Truly. Considering that every time there is a domestic terrorist who's a white supremacist, the entire media rush to condemn the entire right. Okay, do you trust that this administration is really going to preserve First Amendment rights? I have some trouble believing that they are interested in preserving First Amendment rights. Okay, and First Amendment rights do, in fact, apply to everyone. They apply to BLM protesters the same way they apply to white supremacists. I hate all of that. Okay, I hate all of those ideologies. That does not mean that they don't have rights. Okay, but again, there is a political motivation to ignoring one problem here that is much larger than the other problem in terms of size and scope and depth of effect on everyday American life. And again, I just keep pointing this out. The disparity in what the left is willing to acknowledge about ideologies that are closely tied with its own and their connection to violence, and what they are willing to focus on is pretty astonishing. To take an example, Andy McCabe. You'll remember Andrew McCabe. Andrew McCabe, of course, was he was the former FBI agent who was tied into the Russia investigation, and he engaged in ridiculous acts that ended up basically, I believe, losing him his pension. Anyway, Andrew McCabe was on CNN yesterday talking about this, and he said, well, we still don't know what motivated the Congressional baseball shooting. Interesting.
He brought the other side of the equation into it by referring to the shooting of the congressional baseball practice. And he did it very carefully by saying a shooting by someone only who committed the shooting only after he confirmed that the players were Republicans. So I think that reflects the fact that the FBI still doesn't exactly know what that shooter was up to. They never really uncovered the sort of detailed evidence that laid out a specific plot or an objective. But it is undeniable that he was targeting Republicans.
Okay, again, and Andy McCabe suggesting there that the FBI still doesn't know what exactly motivated this. I know the FBI knows full well. The guy had a list in his pocket of Republicans. He was shouting, "This is for healthcare," while he shot Republicans. So yeah, we kind of know. But the temptation by folks on the left to downplay violence so long as it is linked with their side continues to astonish and dismay, because that does have some really negative impact. And I got an email the other day from a member of our military. So the military right now is undergoing all sorts of violent extremist training, violent extremist threat training. So that means that they're sat down and they're put through PowerPoint presentations about the evils of white supremacy and be on the lookout for people who are being recruited into white supremacist groups. And this member of the military raised his hand and he asked the training commanding officer, he asked him, okay, what about BLM and Antifa? And the training commanding officer said, no, those are not extremist groups. Those are just philosophies. Yeah, sure. How's this for a title? Ben Shapiro Show subscriber destroys like button with clicks and logic. I'd watch that. Make it happen, gang.